Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
On April 20th, 1996, 18-year-old Kevin Foster had the urge to blow up something. He and his band of followers had spent the previous 5 weeks on a crime spree. They got a rush out of vandalizing street signs and breaking car windows. They even set a restaurant on fire. On this particular day, the day after the 1-year anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, Kevin aimed to do something ambitious, something that would be featured on the evening news and get splashed across the front pages of the local newspaper. He wanted his next crime to be loud, something that would shake people out of their sleep and cause a cavalry of fire trucks to converge on one place. Kevin had idolized Timothy McVeigh, the domestic terrorist who had carried out the Oklahoma City bombing. Much like McVeigh, Kevin persuaded others to join him on his destructive path. Kevin and his small gang caused a propane explosion inside an abandoned Coca-Cola plant. The explosion sent shockwaves throughout Fort Myers, a small city in southwest Florida comprised of about 20,000 residents. Kevin's gang was called the Lords of Chaos. There were 4 core members, including Kevin, who proclaimed himself to be a godlike figure. The others were reportedly under his spell. 10 days after the plant explosion, the Lords of Chaos, also known as LOC, were preparing to commit another act of vandalism, this time on the campus of a local high school. The school's band teacher, Mark Schwebies, foiled the gang's plans. LOC was preparing to break into the school when Schwebies noticed them and stopped them. He warned the teens that they would probably be hearing from the police the next day. Kevin heard what happened and decided he wasn't going to let a band teacher go to the cops. He didn't want anyone to squeal on him. One of Kevin's followers, Chris Black, possibly his most devoted follower, was the one who reportedly said it out loud. Someone has to die tonight. This is Jillian, and in partnership with Law and Crime, you are listening to Court Junkie, episode 160. Kevin Foster was born in Amarillo, Texas. By the time he was in first grade, he had lived in more than a half dozen places. His mother, Ruby, would marry, get divorced, and remarry a number of times after her children were born. Each time she met someone new, she and her kids would relocate. Kevin was 8 years old when his family moved to Fort Myers for the first time. That first stay didn't last too long because his mother reportedly got restless and moved on with her 4 kids in tow. But there was something about Fort Myers that the Foster family preferred compared to the other places they lived. It was small, tropical, southern, and a place where a dollar could stretch far. By the time Kevin was in middle school, Ruby settled down with her 4th and final husband, back in the town they liked the most. Ruby Foster was a young mother. She wasn't much of an authority figure. Kevin was often left unsupervised. The stepfathers he had were mostly a mixed bag and wouldn't stick around for long. His biological father mostly remained absent in his life. On Christmas morning in 1991, when Kevin was 14 years old, he unwrapped a gift from his mother. It was a brand new shotgun, the first of many firearms he would eventually own. His stepfather at the time, John Foster, owned a pawn shop in the Fort Myers area, and Kevin worked there part-time. Being in a store surrounded by firearms was pleasing to him, and he often posed for pictures at home, enthusiastically holding and aiming rifles and handguns. One night in 1994, Kevin was rushed to the emergency room. He had shot himself by accident with one of his own handguns. He survived his injuries. In every gunshot case, a law enforcement officer is assigned to investigate. The Lee County deputy who had responded to that call would be one of the investigators in the Schwebe's murder 2 years later. Kevin wasn't very well liked at school, and he eventually dropped out. While in school, he had a reputation for being an open racist and for being cruel to animals. In one inscription in his yearbook, someone wrote to him, quote, "Please don't kill anyone this summer because I hear it's pretty bad in prison." The other core members of the Lords of Chaos were Pete Magnotti, Chris Black, and Derek Shields. All three were smart and impressionable. For reasons only they could give, they liked, respected, and followed Kevin. The first to gravitate towards him was Pete Magnotti. He was born in California, and his family moved to Fort Myers when he was 2 years old. He was gifted with a 153 IQ. He had a loner streak and showed no interest in team activities. He showed the same lack of interest in academics, in spite of his intelligence. His teachers noticed his potential, but they couldn't get him to concentrate. He regularly challenged and frustrated his teachers. Pete didn't fit in. Fort Myers was a country town, and he was an outcast. He played clarinet and liked to read comic books. He met Kevin and the two clicked. After the Lords of Chaos took shape, Pete would become Kevin's second in command. He was the one who wrote the gang's manifestos. Here's a sample of what Pete wrote in his personal notebook while a member of LOC. Quote, "My best qualities are that I can think of something so disgustingly repulsive that it will make my best friend Kevin laugh into hysterics. Things that make me happy are torturing small animals, guns, bombs, and fire. Kevin is my bad influence and the person who taught me all kinds of important things, like how to load a Beretta and to make bombs. If you're a person of small stature, like me, you have to talk big, think big, and nobody will say nothing. It also helps to have big friends that own big guns." One of Pete's few close friends was Chris Black. These two got along because they had similar personalities and liked the same underground music. Chris was short and overweight. He clashed with his father. Like Pete, Chris was smart, but mostly disinterested in school. The fourth member of LOC was Derek Shields. Unlike the others, he didn't always like Kevin. But like the others, he was distrusting of most of his classmates and preferred to be around those who were more on the fringes of the school community. He had his own demons. Derek grew up in upstate New York. At age 8, he slipped on some ice. The BB gun he was holding hit the ground and a pellet ricocheted off of a house and struck him in the eye. Eventually, he got an implant lens in his eye so that he could see better. Derek was a gifted athlete, and that translated well on the baseball field. He loved the game. It was Derek's older brother, whom he had admired, who first got him interested in it. Eventually, the Shields family moved to Southwest Virginia. While he was living in Virginia, Derek's older brother, Fred, was the victim of a homicide. That reportedly traumatized Derek. The best role model in his life was gone without warning. Shortly after his family moved to Fort Myers, Derek befriended Pete Magnotti and Chris Black. It was sort of an odd mix. Pete and Chris reportedly liked hard, up-tempo music, mostly industrial rock and heavy metal. Derek liked 90s pop music, and it was usually the softer variety like Mariah Carey. Derek was tall, considered handsome by many, and gifted athletically, while Pete and Chris were not. He was good enough at baseball to play at the college level, and by the time he was 17, colleges across Florida were noticing. Kevin was the clear-cut leader of the group. He literally called himself God. The others followed suit, except for Derek, who often would look at Kevin with a skeptical eye. Pete easily fit into the role of Kevin's first mate. He recruited others to join LOC, and pretty soon others did, but mostly as hangers-on who would join the gang when they were ready to carry out small-scale property crimes like breaking windows out of parked cars. They would detach from the group when things started to get too intense or dangerous. Kevin came up with the Lords of Chaos moniker. The gang's basic mission, according to authorities, was to invoke fear through destructive means. Sam Cooke was a longtime columnist for the Fort Myers News Press. He wrote several pieces about LOC, its crimes, and their aftermath. Here he is describing how the gang's criminal activities were dictated by the whims of its leader.
These guys, everything was a joke to them, with Foster leading the way. And, he was the boss, and whatever he said went. And there was nobody telling him what to do.
The members got a rush out of hearing glass break or watching objects burn. On March 24th, 1996, the charred shells of 2 Jeep Cherokees were found abandoned in Lehigh Acres, a non-incorporated area east of Fort Myers. The Lee County Sheriff's Sergeant who first inspected the burned vehicles realized immediately that it was arson. There was no way those vehicles could have burned that severely without an accelerant. It was later learned the vehicles were brand new and stolen off a dealership lot. They were valued at $60,000. The group continued their crime spree. They called in bomb threats. They damaged cars that were parked outside churches and stores. They toppled street signs. They opened fire hydrants. On one warm April night, they busted the windows of a set of parked taxis that were parked in a line along the street. When a witness saw them and screamed out to them to stop, they fled in Kevin's Toyota sedan. The witness told authorities that the getaway car had a noisy muffler. On another night, Kevin, Pete, and Chris drove by the Hut, which at the time was a well-known Fort Myers area restaurant. Pete and Chris suggested burglarizing the restaurant, but Kevin had other ideas. One of the members heard what sounded like animals chirping or screaming from inside the restaurant. The noises were coming from 2 caged exotic birds. They were macaws. The bright-colored birds were favorites of the staff and customers. Each macaw was valued at $2,000. The cage itself cost another $1,000. Kevin decided to set fire to the building. The fire the boys set that night resulted in the death of one of those birds. The other was saved. The resulting media attention from the Hut fire didn't satisfy Kevin, who was hell-bent on inflicting more damage. He wanted to send a message. He wanted his next fire to light up the sky. He set his mind on setting fire to an abandoned Coca-Cola plant, one of the biggest buildings in Fort Myers. April 19, 1996 was the 3rd anniversary of the Waco siege and the 1-year anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. The planning stage of Kevin's next crime lasted all evening and well past midnight, so the Coca-Cola plant explosion didn't take place on the actual anniversary date, which is what Kevin had wanted. Even still, the plan was carried out. Kevin and his crew loaded 10 stolen propane tanks onto the bed of a pickup truck and drove to the abandoned historical building at the corner of Edison and Cleveland Avenues, near the heart of Fort Myers. 6 LOC members, including all 4 of the core members, participated in the creation of the destructive bomb. They strategically placed the tanks in various parts of the building and turned all the knobs to open the tanks. In a stroke of irony that Kevin was reportedly proud of, the homemade flash bomb designed to ignite the gas was made using a Pepsi can. If anyone was awake and in the vicinity of the building, that person easily would have heard the hissing from the tanks. Chris was standing guard by the getaway vehicle across the street and could hear it. Eventually, the other 5 members sprinted out of the building towards the truck. They all then fled to a nearby park where the plant was still within sight. It took about 12 minutes for the propane bomb to detonate. The explosion was massive. Shards of glass landed on US 41, the main north-south highway that cuts through Fort Myers. The fire kept getting bigger and bigger. The gang sat at a picnic table and watched the scene unfold. The plant was a total loss. And Kevin got the media attention he had hoped for.
That was for fun. You know, they lit the place on fire and they watched it burn like a birthday cake.
Destruction of property wasn't the only kind of criminal behavior Kevin had in mind for LOC. He had hoped to make use of his firearm collection. His most horrifying idea was to commit a mass shooting at Florida's biggest resort complex. On graduation night, which was weeks away, the core members of LOC had planned to travel with the Riverdale graduating class to Disney World, dress up in costumes, and then open fire on random victims. Kevin wanted all the targeted victims to be Black. Thankfully, that massacre never happened. Instead, the last and worst of LOC's crimes took place on the night of April 30th, 10 days after the Coca-Cola plant bombing. April 30th, 1996 was a big day for Mark Schwiebes. The Marine Corps veteran was well into his teaching career by then. He had purchased a lot and his new house was about to be under construction. The day he was murdered, the foundation had been poured. Schwiebes also had established a scholarship program for students whose parents had financial difficulties. Financing their children's band camp trips were too difficult for some parents, so Schwiebes would find ways to raise money to cover those costs. One of his first ideas was holding an ice cream social. It was held on that very date, April 30th.
If you had a student at Riverdale High School, you would want him in Mark Schwiebes' band because this guy put the students first and was always helping them.
Schwiebes was still on the Riverdale campus as the sun was setting. He had to be at the local Cracker Barrel restaurant to have dinner with a band booster. As he was pulling out of the parking lot, he noticed 2 young males standing by a payphone. Schwiebes drove towards them to see whether they needed a ride home. The 2 students were Chris Black and Tom Tyrone. Tom was a fringe member of LOC. He and Chris were not the only ones in the vicinity. A few more members of LOC, including Pete and Derek, were nearby, but they were hidden and Schwiebes never noticed them. He did catch a glimpse of one other suspicious person. Kevin Foster was walking across the street towards Tom and Chris when he saw Schwiebes' Ford Bronco heading in his direction. He sprinted away and ran towards the woods. Schwiebes called out to the person fleeing, but he kept running. Schwiebes then turned his attention to the 2 boys standing at the payphone. They hadn't moved. Schwiebes asked them what they were doing. Chris did most of the talking. He told him that he was making a phone call. Schwiebes knew that was a lie because the payphone hadn't been working. It had been damaged a few weeks earlier. Chris and Tom knew that too, because it was LOC who had damaged it. Schwiebes noticed the boys had a bag in their possession. It contained a fire extinguisher, some canned peaches, and other items. The plan that night was to use the cans of peaches to break the windows of the auditorium, enter the school, and then damage it from the inside. Schwiebes also noticed that Tom had on a pair of gloves. It gets hot in Fort Myers in late April, even at night, so that too aroused Schwiebes' suspicions. He asked the teens about the gloves, and Chris responded with a smart aleck answer. We like to wear gloves. Is that against the law? He asked. Schwebe's confiscated the bag of supplies and placed it in his trunk. He warned Chris and Tom that they might get a summons the next morning from the law enforcement officer assigned to the school. Schwebe's drove away, and Chris reportedly threw a temper tantrum. Kevin confronted the pair later, and he also lost his cool. In the end, the gang didn't break any laws that night. They were caught before the act. Nothing got broken or damaged at the school, but Kevin and his underlings still had a lot to be nervous about. Kevin distrusted Tom. He thought this skinny, naive kid would crack under the pressure of being confronted by police and then disclose everything LOC had done. Chris had the same worries as Kevin. He was the one who first articulated an idea. He uttered the words, "Somebody has to die tonight." Kevin decided in that moment to make the inexplicable leap from vandalism to premeditated murder. The target would be Mark Schwebe's, and they needed to act fast before the band teacher could tell anyone about what he had witnessed that night. During the era of landline telephones, it was rather easy for people to obtain phone numbers and addresses. There was the White Pages and 411. Chris Black called 411 from a payphone to get Mark Schwebe's number and address. He called the listed number to make sure it was the right one. He got the band teacher's answering machine. The voice on the outgoing message sounded just like the man who had confronted him a short time earlier. Tom Tyrone didn't like the developments of that evening and decided to disengage from the group and go home. The same went for Chris Burnett, another associate of the gang. That meant the murder plot fell on the 4 core members: Kevin Foster, Chris Black, Pete Magnotti, and Derek Shields. The plan was to knock on the front door at Schwebe's house, lure him outside, and then fatally shoot him. The media reported that the murder weapon was Kevin's shotgun, the same one his mother had bought for him when he was 14 years old. Chris volunteered to be the getaway driver. Pete, the one member of the core group who had the most apprehension about committing murder that night, would remain in the car. Derek played a pivotal role in the slaying. He was the one chosen to knock on the door, since he had been one of Schwebe's students. Kevin's line of thinking was that Schwebe's would look outside to see who was knocking at such a late hour, see a familiar face, and be comfortable enough to step out onto the front porch. Derek didn't idolize Kevin the way the others did, but Kevin still managed to convince him to be the decoy. Derek would later allege that he took part in the plot because Kevin threatened to kill him if he didn't. Their murderous plan was set into motion. Derek knocked on the door. Schwebe's answered, and then Derek immediately took off running. A puzzled Schwebe stepped forward, and Kevin, who was donning a trench coat, fatigues, and a ski mask, emerged from the dark and fired his shotgun. The pellets sprayed into Schwebe's face, and he collapsed to the ground. Kevin fired one more shot to his pelvic region. Authorities would later say that second shot was fired there intentionally because Kevin assumed Schwebe's was gay and wanted to mutilate him. The shotgun blast to the face was fatal. Schwebe's died that night on his doorstep.
It was an impulse killing. And Foster wasn't going to let any of them back out of it.
The group sped away in Kevin's Toyota. A neighbor who heard the shots and that noisy muffler called 911. Randy McGrother, who for 30 years prosecuted murder cases in the 20th Judicial Circuit, which includes Lee County, met with sheriff's investigators shortly after the murder. McGrother told the media that before any leads trickled in, detectives openly wondered whether Schwebe's was involved in any sort of love triangle. The shotgun wound to his pelvic region may have indicated something of that nature. Meanwhile, the Riverdale community mourned the loss of their band teacher.
People were crying at work, and it was just a horrible situation. The shock is still in these people's lives.
There was a deep desire not only to solve the case, but to do so quickly. As it turned out, investigators didn't have to wait long for their first solid lead. Kevin had bragged about it to one of LOC's fringe members, who then told his girlfriend about it. She promptly called law enforcement and told detectives that her boyfriend had information about the Schwebe's killing. The sheriff's office called in the boyfriend, who then spilled everything to those detectives. The puzzle pieces fell into place quickly. Kevin was arrested 3 days after the Schwebe's killing. He was en route to a planned robbery of a local Hardee's restaurant. Kevin took one look at the deputies who converged on him and told them, "I'll see you in hell." The other core members, Chris, Derek, and Pete, were rounded up as well. The apparent spell they were under wore off in jail. All 3 of them turned on their leader. Pete was offered the best deal, up to 32 years in prison in exchange for testifying against Kevin. The 32-year sentence was by design, 1 year of prison for every year of Schwebe's life. Chris and Derek were offered 2 choices: plead guilty and serve life in prison, or stand trial and possibly get the death penalty. Both of them agreed to plead guilty and serve life. To get that, they too needed to testify against Kevin. A few more teens were charged with other crimes related to LOC. That included Tom Tyrone and Chris Burnett, both of whom had accompanied Kevin, Chris, Pete, and Derek at the thwarted vandalism at Riverdale, as well as the Coca-Cola plant arson. Both received jail sentences and probation. In all, 4 people were charged in connection with Schwebe's murder, but there was only one who stood trial. Kevin Foster was offered a deal that included life in prison in exchange for a full confession. Reportedly thinking he would get more notoriety while on death row, Kevin refused the offer to plead guilty and serve life. So the state moved forward with its pursuit of the death penalty against him. He was tried in March 1998, nearly 2 years after the slaying. During the trial, Kevin Foster was an obedient defendant. He declined to testify, but he did his part otherwise. That included dressing up for the jury.
I remember coming in and, I sat behind him. And I kind of did a double take. I wondered if I was in the right courtroom because Foster looked very nice, like he was going to church. And it was far from that.
In his defense, Kevin claimed he had an alibi. He insisted that he was home the night of Schwebe's murder. The originator of this alibi was reportedly John Foster, Kevin's stepfather. He died before the case went to trial, so it fell on Kevin's mother and sister to take the stand and testify that Kevin was home that night. But every member of LOC who testified, including Chris, Pete, and Derek, said Kevin was not only present that night, but that he was the one who had planned the murder and fired the shotgun. Someone else also undercut Ruby Foster's attempt at establishing an alibi for her son. That person was Rebecca Magnotti, Pete Magnotti's mother. She said that Ruby had called her and asked her for her help in concocting an alibi. She refused and reported that phone call to the authorities. Ruby Foster's testimony included several statements that reportedly lacked credibility. Even when she was asked a straightforward question, for example, she would stammer a lot and correct herself. When she was asked how many children she had, for instance, she answered that she had 3 kids. When she was asked to name them, she gave 4 names. At one point, she was asked by the prosecutor whether she kept a tight rein on her son while she raised him. She answered, "No, or yes, well, maybe not."
She was just out of it. She was this was beyond her. I don't know if she'd ever been to court or anything, but she was just out of place, and it was just weird.
The jury found Kevin guilty. It was on to the penalty phase. 3 prosecutors handled the case for the state. One of them was Bob Lee, who questioned witnesses during the penalty phase and then gave closing arguments. When a former teacher at Riverdale testified on Kevin's behalf in an effort to sway the jury to recommend a life sentence instead of the death penalty, she elicited a strong reaction from Lee. That teacher, Carol Perella, described Kevin as a loving young man who cared about his friends. Her son had been friends with him. During his cross-examination, Lee asked her whether she was familiar with Eddie Haskell, the character on the classic TV sitcom Leave It to Beaver. She told him she knew the reference. Eddie Haskell showed one face to adults and a totally different face to his peers, Lee said to her. She responded, I knew several students like that. Kevin is a fine young man. Lee countered by asking her, do fine young men murder innocent people? Perella didn't have a good answer. The defense did its part to try to keep Kevin off of death row. Defense attorney Robert Jacobs asked the jury to picture his client as a small bird. He then said, you can crush him or put him in a cage for the rest of his life. When it was Lee's turn to speak to the jury, he emphasized that Schwebe's was murdered simply because he foiled an act of vandalism. He said, this killing had no shred of moral pretense. The complete senselessness was done strictly to protect his skin and the Lords of Chaos. The only penalty that will bring out justice is the highest. With a 9-3 vote, the jury recommended the death penalty. In 1998, Florida only required a majority vote from the jury for a death penalty recommendation. The law changed a few years ago, and now the death penalty requires the jury to be unanimous. There was a chance that Kevin's death sentence would be overturned with the new law, but that didn't happen. The Florida Supreme Court denied Kevin's appeal in 2018. He remains where he has been for 23 years. Now, this is typically where the story would end, but not this one. Kevin's trial in 1998 generated a lot of media coverage. Certain members of the Foster family were reportedly not kind to the throngs of reporters who attended the trial, particularly those from the Fort Myers News Press, which published several articles that family members thought painted them in a negative light. One particular reporter, who during his long print journalism career covered trials from Fort Myers to Fort Lauderdale, would say years later that he never got a more rude or chillier reception from a defendant's family compared to what he got from Ruby Foster and her daughter. Sam Cooke got similar treatment from the Foster women. He said one of them, at one point, told him to drop dead. Strangely enough, however, there was one news press reporter who the Foster family warmed up to. His name was Jim Greenhill, who covered public safety for the Fort Myers News Press while Kevin was in jail. He somehow won Kevin's trust, too. Greenhill, who later wrote a book about the Lords of Chaos titled Somebody Has to Die Tonight, was the one journalist who interviewed Kevin in prison. He would ride to where Kevin was incarcerated, at Union Correctional Center outside Stark, Florida, and be accompanied by Kevin's mother. In the end, Ruby and Kevin got very comfortable with Greenhill. Kevin Foster would eventually admit to Greenhill that he was, in fact, the shooter. That was something he had denied for years following his arrest. He had always insisted that he had been home the night of the killing. Additionally, Kevin gave Greenhill 3 names of people who had testified against him in court, 3 people who were associates of the Lords of Chaos. He told Greenhill that those 3 men needed to be killed so that they couldn't testify against him again, in case he won his appeal and was granted a retrial. Kevin asked Greenhill to assassinate them. It didn't end there. Ruby Foster also asked Greenhill to kill those 3 witnesses. She even added a 4th name to the killing list and handed Greenhill a shotgun. She also suggested to Greenhill that he use lime when he buried the bodies so that animals couldn't dig up the remains. Greenhill went to the authorities. Years later, after his book was published, Greenhill explained himself in emails to his friend and former colleague, Sam Cooke. Here's Sam reading from one of those emails.
Whatever your view on the ethics of it, and mine have changed over the last decade, I did what I did because he had never confessed to any authority figure, and I felt that the only way to get him to open up was to get alongside him.
In that same email, Greenhill also addressed Kevin's request for him to kill witnesses. Kevin saw it as a quid pro quo.
Immediately after he told me was when he brought up the idea of me killing witnesses. It was literally, now I've told you this, there's something you can do for me in return.
After he went to law enforcement, Greenhill was fitted for a wire and went back to Kevin and Ruby Foster. Their incriminating statements were recorded and obtained by investigators, who subsequently arrested Ruby and added another felony charge against Kevin. Ruby was convicted of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. She served about half of that sentence and was released in 2004. Kevin was also convicted of conspiracy and had an additional 5 years tacked on to his sentence. Derek Shields and Chris Black, now both 43 years old, are serving life sentences. Derek has sought clemency, but those efforts have so far failed. The former sheriff of Lee County was among those who advocated for Derek. Since his conviction, Derek has apologized to the Schwebe's family. Schwebe's sister, a pastor, has accepted. Pete Magnotti, now 42, is serving the remainder of his time at the Cross City Work Camp, about an hour west of Gainesville, Florida. He is scheduled to be released from prison in July 2023. Kevin Foster is now 43 years old. There's no word on if or when Kevin's death certificate will be signed. Since his inauguration in 2019, Governor Ron DeSantis has signed 2 death warrants, none since August 2019. There are 330 inmates on Florida's death row. More than 1/3 of them have lived there longer than Kevin. And that's all for this episode. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this case. Let me know by joining the conversation on Instagram at CourtJunkie, by tweeting me at CourtJunkiePod, or by emailing me at podcast@courtjunkie.com. This episode was researched and written by Tony Holt. If you'd like to hear these episodes without the ads and hear additional Court Junkie bonus episodes, check out my Patreon options at courtjunkie.com/support. And be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/courtjunkie. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.